understand the environment and our ability to improve our environmental management. And we're very fortunate to have a team of people here today from the Center for Embedded Network Sensing at UCLA. The Foresight and Governance Project was able to recruit them into an effort to do an overview of what's happening in this area, what's happening with the technology, what kind of environmental applications are emerging, and what kind of research needs really need to be pursued. And there's a report. If you didn't pick it up when you came in, you're welcome to get it when you come out. That is a really beautiful production that summarizes what they've done. And the presentation here today is a summary of the summary. I'm just going to introduce each of them briefly and then let it roll. I'll introduce in the order of people speaking in. The first is Tom Harmon down at the end. He's a professor in the School of Engineering and a founding faculty member at the University of California at Merced. And he directs the contaminant observation and management application area for the Center for Embedded Network Sensing, which I'm going to call CENS from now on, since I don't want to pronounce that all the time. He's also co-chair of the Sensor Network Subcommittee within the National Waters Network Proposal Development Area. Then we'll hear from Deborah Estrin, who's a professor of computer science at UCLA. And she was the founder and is the director of CENS and holds the John Postel Chair in Computer Networks at UCLA. And then we'll hear from Jeff Goldman, who I understand had a lot to do with this report. Jeff is the director of program development at CENS, and he's co-principal investigator and a member of the board of directors of the National Ecological Observatory Network. I've just given you the very tip of their bios, but I think it already gives you a sense that we couldn't have a better group of people to bring us right up to the leading edge of what's happening in this area.
Thank you, Bob. And thank everyone for the nice turnout. It's nice to see so many people here. We discussed how to summarize this, and we came up with the following plan that I would start off by giving you a flavor for what sensor systems might do in the area of water quality management with a few salient examples. And some of these examples are also highlighted in this paper. And then once you have a taste for what they can do, Deborah will tunnel in a little bit deeper and tell you a little bit more about the technology. Jeff will try to tie it all up so you can walk away with some good knowledge today. So what I'm going to start by talking to you. Oh, okay.
We can just all move over if you want.
Yeah.
Actually, I think I'd probably present it better, too, if I was standing. So thank you very much. So what I'm going to start by is talking about a little bit just up front of kind of then to now. How do we used to look at things in water quality management? How are we starting to look at them now? Start by telling you what we mean by these sensor systems. It's more than just a sensing device sitting out there spitting data back at us. And then what can we do now with these things? Because when we really sit down and think about it, the sensing capabilities are a little bit limited at the moment. But there are some very important things that we can do now and should do now. And then as the technology matures on the sensor front, we'll be able to plug in and use the technology in the networking side that we've developed. So sensor systems can take a lot of forms. They can range from massive, very expensive sensors in satellites and aircraft, looking at the big picture of the environment, down to the ground where we have stationary embedded sentinels watching over time in a single location, to robotic sensors which can be out there continuously scanning in space, but probably at intermittent in times, not all the time in the same place, of course. Even to citizenry-held PDA type sensing, where we might have a human-actuated sensor moving around, taking their impression, collecting data on a watershed or a water management issue. But what are these things really? As I said, they're more than just the transmission of data. The real enabling technology here is the two-way communication and the synthesizing of data as it comes in, so that as we aggregate the signals from several different kinds of sensors, each sensor giving some data on the property of the environment, the aggregated signal actually tells us something we really want to know about the system. At the same time, we think it will probably tell us some things we never expected to see. So let's look at this example. This is kind of a precision agriculture, or some people like to call it precision conservation type situation, where we don't want to over-fertilize, because if we over-fertilize, the fertilizer may run off into streams, it may percolate into groundwater, and we have problems to clear up on the other end. So current technology would definitely allow us to plant moisture, temperature, and in some cases, early stages of nitrate sensors into the soil. We definitely have the capability to monitor microclimate, so we can see how much water is evaporating when we water. We can basically do an accounting of all the water and somewhat of an accounting on the fertilizer. And instead of seeing row after row after row of data coming back to our computer, we have models, we have the know-how to integrate that data in near real time so that the actual message comes up that says too much fertilizer or not enough fertilizer. That's what the farmer in the field needs to see. The farmer in the field doesn't want to come home to a 15,000-line Excel spreadsheet that tells him the moisture, the temperature, and the nitrate levels. So some sensors are ready to go. So let's talk a little bit about septic tanks, a lovely topic for Friday morning. Septic tanks are probably a little more than potentially a big problem in the United States. Where I'm from, Merced, California, about a mile outside of downtown Merced, all the houses have septic tanks. There's no sewers out there. So there are many of these things, thousands of them across the country. And poor placement, bad construction, poor operation lead to excessive releases from septic tanks. If they're in high-density areas, this can actually be quite a significant source of contamination to watersheds, to groundwater. So a sensor system that could be created to monitor this distributed problem, which is very impractical to have personnel going from place to place to place, checking on each septic tank. A more automated system would be quite valuable. So similar to the agricultural problem, we do have moisture sensors, we do have water pressure sensors, so we can look at the level of water, how fast the water is moving. We have sensors that are very robust for measuring the salinity or saltiness of the water, which could be an indicator for septic leachate. So we could look at several types of way of designing this system. It really depends on how smart you want it to be. The most passive technique might be called a sentinel sensor system, where we basically just watch downstream of the septic field. And as long as nothing shows up there, we're reasonably sure that the septic system is performing okay. But if something does show up down there, the system triggers the homeowner, the regulatory agency, whoever, to come and attend to the potential problem. We may want to look at it in with a little bit more sophistication. A more active approach would be to have a larger network of sensors that are actually looking at the pattern emanating from a septic field. Maybe associating that with simple statistics, or maybe using a more sophisticated process model to say whether or not that pattern is reminiscent of a healthy septic field or an unhealthy septic field. So does a pattern change? Is that change okay, or is it a bad pattern? Now, if you'll bear with me here, then this is maybe even a more proactive approach, where perhaps sometimes changes in the environment are slow or gradual enough that you can miss them unless you're very careful. They can be very subtle things. So we found in many of our test bed deployments that actually perturbing the system in a way that you can bring about an anticipated response is a nice, efficient way of seeing how things are working. So imagine, if you will, each month when you received your municipal utilities bill, maybe there's a little dissolvable pill that you would put in your toilet each month and flush it. And that pill would release some chemical that's not harmful for the environment, but easily sensed by your network in a unique way that would send basically a pulse or a signal through your septic field. And you would maybe send that signal back to your wireless at your computer. The utility would have provided you with the software to collect that signal, run it through an algorithm, and say thumbs up or thumbs down. Another big problem, related problem, non-point source pollution. So in the days of the Clean Water Act, the environmental engineering profession did a very good job of attacking the problem at the end of the big pipes. But we now, due to huge population pressure on our water resources, have to tackle the problem of non-point source pollution, so distributed points all over this watershed. And I've tried to indicate that with this mapped out watershed here, where we have different land uses in all these boxes. There's water streaming off of these at different amounts, bringing different chemicals. How do you sort it all out? How do you manage this situation? Well, these sensor networks would enable managing this situation in pretty much the same way we've managed the big pipe problems. We turn the non-point source problem into lots of little point sources. And we distributed sensors at key locations in the watershed. So in this case, I show the dots going along the river, but eventually you could move those dots upstream to the ditches and drainage from each farm area, and you could assimilate all this information. It needs to be presented to management and decision makers in a acceptable manner, namely in some context, a rich GIS type context, for example, so that they can actually see where and when chemicals are appearing at the wrong time. Okay, what about when sensors are not ready? So we have, certainly in California, and I was just in Chicago yesterday and learned on Lake Michigan, same situation with beach closures. The current paradigm with beach closures is that there's regular sampling, and a human goes out in the morning and grabs some water, sends it off to the laboratory. The laboratory methods take a while. And so in about 24 hours, you find out whether there were fecal coliform in the water at that beach. And if it's a positive enough reading, you might issue a beach closure today for something that occurred yesterday, and you're not really sure what the conditions are today. So you can see obviously there's a problem there, and lots of, in the middle of summer on Huntington Beach, this can be quite an economic issue, closing the beach. So we would love to be able to detect pathogens or pathogen indicators more directly and in real time. We can't yet. We think this will be coming, but we can't yet. In the meantime, surrogates are important to sense. So something that usually correlates with the presence or absence of a pathogen can be sensed. For example, in this case, you might imagine a sensor for turbidity, which measures the light transmission through water, is an indication of some sort of particulate matter being present in the water, could trigger a sampling event at a certain threshold, and then ping the investigator that I've just seen some turbid water, I've grabbed a sample, come and get it and perform analysis on it. It doesn't directly solve the time lag problem yet. That would take the more direct sensing approach. But perhaps if you saw enough of these triggering events and you were able to correlate it with 75% of the time when I go out and get that sample, it has E. coli in it, you might create a policy that just goes with the turbidity event. Of course, a direct approach is always better, so we're striving for that. And I pretty much just, what I just described was known as actuated sample collection. I got a little bit ahead of myself. So the event-triggered sample actuation method is a very important part of the sensor network because there's, as you can probably appreciate, there's always going to be a next sensor that you're waiting for. So you're always going to want to have the capacity of letting simpler signals indicate when to collect a sample and take it back for a more sophisticated analysis. Combined sewer overflows, we do not have these so much in the West Coast. These are more of an East Coast phenomena where the sewer system combines municipal sewer flows and stormwater runoff. Works great during dry periods, but sometimes when there's a big storm, you can overload these systems and releases have to occur into sensitive water bodies. The Great Lakes, Chesapeake Bay, coastal waters can receive injections basically of stormwater mixed with municipal wastewater. This is a very natural setting for sensor networks because in this setting you have a very good feel for where to put the sensors already. It's not as complicated as the non-point source problem. You've got a network of pipes. You have good system knowledge of what the key pipes are. You have a way of knowing where to put flow sensors, valves and actuators to shift the flow around. So in this case, you can actually use the sensing system to do something about it. And some municipalities are already starting to look into this. So in this case, we can go back to the weather stations. We have good, cheap weather stations that can be distributed in a watershed. They're robust, long-lasting. You can start to link the storm event to what flows you'll expect to see in the sewer. You can prepare for shunting flows off into detention basins. And you can actually start to look at water quality in those flows to maybe decide that you don't need to shunt it off because it's clean enough. Maybe the first few storms of the year have passed and the system's not that dirty anymore. So this is a glimpse of where we've come to at this point and some ideas about what we might do. I wanted to give you a flair for the multiple scales of observation. Sometimes we look at the big picture from a satellite or airplane. We didn't talk about that very much, but we look down at the soil level or the stream level or the pipe level. So there's different scales of observation. Lots of the applications are available right now because we have some pretty robust sensors for things for like flow, temperature, salinity. We can make a lot of headway with these. And we can use actuated sampling to bridge us to the next generation of sensors. And some of the sensor systems are ready for testing today. And what sorts of sensing technologies that are currently being tested is what Deborah's going to take you into right now.
Great. I'm actually going to sit, but not in front of the screen. Thank you. There's a lag. A long lag.
Or maybe you didn't sense it.
There we go.
Just twist it.
Could you just rotate a little bit towards me?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. So I want to step back a little bit with respect to some of the underlying technologies and why it really is the right time to be developing some of these systems. So many critical environmental processes have high, let's see, let me actually get on the right slide. There we go. Many critical environmental processes, including the ones that Tom was referring to, have high frequency spatial variations and exhibit tremendous amounts of heterogeneity. And it's really when you have this high amount of variability and heterogeneity that you need dense sensing, because otherwise you can get away with a single point of measurement and a model or some other way of estimating what a value is at another point. So embedded sensing is very important for scientists in the development of richer models that capture this heterogeneity and to enable monitoring and management at spatial resolutions that aren't achievable with remote or manual sensing alone. The technology behind these applications involves embedding distributed devices to monitor and interact with the physical world, but doing so in such a way as to create programmable, multimodal, multi-scale, and multi-use observatories. So as Tom said, it's not just a matter of installing the sensors and spitting out the data. There are many technical challenges posed by these systems, and what's interesting about them is really the combination of constraints and challenges. It's not so much that the objectives alone that you see on your far left are unique, or that the challenges alone or constraints alone are unique, but rather in combination to create what are really robust sensing systems in the context of resource-limited devices and tremendous amounts of environmental and sensing uncertainty. And while Moore's law has significantly reduced the cost and increased the capability of embeddable wireless devices, the sensor devices themselves, the transducers, develop far more slowly than the supporting platforms. And that being said, though, commercially available devices are available for many physical and chemical measures of interest, and advancements in sensor technology, as Tom mentioned, are going to further transform the wireless sensing systems that we're putting in place as new capabilities broaden the range of physical, chemical, biological, in situ, and autonomous observations. But let's look a little bit more at some of what's out there now. Key physical parameters are all readily observable with commercially off-the-shelf products using sensors that are in robust field-ready forms, and they range from $10 to $100 for things like temperature sensors, $100 to $1,000 for things like moisture content sensors. And then, of course, there are more costly systems such as sophisticated light sensors or acoustic-based sensors for mapping of velocity fields. And these are also important components of these embedded sensing systems. We're not talking only about a large number of very small, cheap devices, but rather in combination with larger, more sophisticated devices that are, of course, then deployed in smaller numbers. The story is not quite as rosy with respect to chemical sensors, but nevertheless, basic water quality parameters are commercially available, often in multi-parameter packages such as data sondes that are already packaged for harsh environments, harsh conditions. When it comes to ionic species such as chloride, sodium, nutrients, things like nitrate and ammonium, ion selective electrode ISE sensors are available for laboratory analysis. However, their use in field deployments is somewhat hampered by limited sensitivity and reliability. Fortunately, for things like runoff and septic tank observations that Tom was talking about, you don't really need parts per billion detection limits. And new materials are leading to more robust ISEs. And, for example, the nitrate ISEs have already been used in successful longer field tests. Still, this is an area where there's much work needed to create deployable chemical sensors for a broad spectrum of inorganic contaminants, and these need to be long-lasting and with reasonable calibration requirements. And sensor packages for quantifying total nitrogen and total phosphorus are particularly critical to understand nutrient cycling and loading of concern to this community. Now, laboratory-based approaches to biological sensing are well established, but these techniques are generally quite time-consuming. They're based on some process of microscopy, culture, and then some form of analysis, and they're really not easily transferable to in-situ sensors. So the development of sensors for routine in the field identification and quantification of potentially harmful microorganisms and biologically active compounds is a high priority for environmental science. Currently, there are few field-ready sensors that can detect important biological entities and their byproducts. And although research into such sensors is taking place, the lack of availability of small, robust, and field-ready biosensors does limit the utility of distributed sensing systems in environmental biology. These biological sensors must be sensitive enough to detect their target at low concentrations in the presence of really complex background matrix. And until such systems are available, lower concentration detection has to be achieved by concentrating the target molecules or cells from relatively large volumes of water. Which is why, as Tom described, given that this direct sensing of many target biological compounds is not always possible, that it seems, and it in fact seems inevitable, that even as technology progresses, lab-based analysis will always outpace what we can do in the field. So therefore, this approach of indicator or event-triggered sensors and proxy sensors can really be used to great advantage, and it points to the importance of multiple modalities and many scales of data collection integrated into to effective larger systems. And so it's useful to consider what are really several different types of sensing systems that can be used alone or in combination to achieve different spatial and temporal coverage. So we have static sensing systems, and I'll say a little bit more about each of these. Static sensing systems, mobile robotic sensing systems, and mobile handheld sensing. And in general, there's a trade-off that you'll see between the spatial extent, the area that can be covered by a system, and the number of measurement points that can be established in the area, the spatial resolution for any fixed budget, manpower, or dollars. And there's also a trade-off between spatial and temporal resolution. In static sensing systems, here what this is it's a little hard to see. It's some buoys depicted along a stream. In static sensing systems, nodes are deployed and remain fixed during the measurement period, and the nodes may be in place for several months or years, depending on the target question. The hardware costs and the cost of securing the devices from vandalism are often what limit the number of sensor nodes deployed for any specific study. And the trade-off I just mentioned between area that can be covered by the sensors and the sampling density that can be achieved in that area is often what dominates your experimental design. Nevertheless, these static sensing systems are a critical tool for environmental monitoring, but they are less effective in situations where there's very complex spatial resolution at very small spatial scales, because the need to replicate the sensors at very high density becomes cost prohibitive, and in some cases is just technically prohibitive because of the interference of sensors very close to one another. And in this is one context in which mobile robotic sensing systems are much better suited. So in mobile or actuated sensing systems, one or more sensors move to the location of interest, and in many cases they do that automatically. And it's, for us, across a range of applications that we work in at the center, mobility has really become our only means to fully sample high spatially variable phenomenon, because static sensors cannot be feasibly placed at such high spatial density. And mobility, mobile systems allow for coverage actually in multiple dimensions and at multiple scales, and thus provide access to profiling large volumes of water, air, and so forth. Robotic or autonomous mobility may be facilitated by infrastructure such as aerial robotic devices hanging off of aerial cables, underwater cables, tracks, vertical above ground towers or underwater buoys, or in fact moving vehicles that are moving on air, land, or are waterborne. And these robotic systems that move over some of them over much more limited spatial extents may be permanently installed where you need continuous monitoring, or installed as a rapid deployment to profile shorter timescale dynamics, something I'll say more about in a moment. Now, of course, robotic systems have higher minimum power requirements to power the motors to make the mobility happen. But given that mobility is often somewhat infrastructure-based, such as I mentioned, towers, aerial cables, and buoys, it's often feasible actually to equip the system with adequate combinations of battery and solar panel support, and increasingly fuel cell support, to make these systems really self-sustaining even off the grid. Now, another powerful form of mobile and actuated systems employs humans to move and manipulate the instruments. As we all know, extremely powerful handheld computers that incorporate low-power processors, wireless communication capabilities, and flexible sensor interfaces are widely used in both personal and industrial applications. And these PDAs are programmable, increasingly contain integrated cameras, microphones, GPS receivers, short-range radios such as Bluetooth, which then give you access to a large array of external sensors as well. Now, to date, most environmental monitoring efforts have incorporated these sophisticated devices for more or less basic data entry. Over time, though, we see them as creating a new type of mobile sensing system. Actually, the use of these devices for field data entry alone by itself eliminates manual and often error-prone sort of paper-to-digital encoding steps, but it also has the potential to greatly enhance data quality by things like prompting the user to add a metadata, automating routine tasks such as time and geocoding, automatically uploading. More interestingly, checking for data validity. If a user enters a value that seems quite out of range for the particular location and process that they're monitoring, automatically georeferencing the data, enabling users to record contextual information such as associated and geocoded photographs or voice annotations, and of course automatically uploading data so that it can then be actually in real time incorporated into models on the back end and perhaps identify data gaps before the person leaves the field. Now, beyond improving the efficiency and the quality of data collection by trained professionals, handheld computers or smartphones can also be distributed to many people, to citizens, who can take part in coordinated data collection efforts, creating diverse, distributed, human-powered sensing systems at local, regional, continental, and ultimately global scales. And such participatory sensing networks could give rise to a really unprecedented amount and variety of data about the environment and human activity. So, was I on the wrong slide that whole time? So often these phenomena of interest we've been discussing vary at multiple scales, multiple spatial scales and multiple time scales. And in such cases, multiscale systems consisting of combinations of these different sensing platforms, but yet acting in concert, can help to capture the complex phenomena of interest. And as Tom mentioned, remote sensing, be it airborne or satellite, typically are used to collect data over large areas, but only at relatively low spatial and temporal resolution. However, remote sensing systems such as those can also be used as another tier in a multiscale system where the in situ measures are used to ground truth the remote sensing, but also the remote sensing is used to guide the placement and interpretation of the in situ data. Skip over. You already took that out for me. Little hard to see here, but bear with me. So as we mentioned, the dense spatial coverage of robotic systems usually comes with a trade-off against sampling frequency. When you move, you're not continuously monitoring in the previous position. And of course, this is how much this matters is dominated by the time required to return to any given point. Depends on the number of other points being sampled, and of course also on the temporal dynamics of the phenomenon. So adaptive sampling techniques can be used then to optimize this trade-off between spatial and temporal resolution by more intelligently directing the node to focus on regions requiring additional spatial or temporal sampling density. And adaptive sampling techniques can therefore help allocate sensor resources as efficiently as possible by controlling where and when to make measurements. This can happen at design time, standard sort of experimental and system design, but it can also happen at runtime. So in static sensing systems also, adaptive sampling can be used to dynamically vary the temporal sampling rate of different sensors so that they collect samples more frequently during periods when values are changing more rapidly. And this can save power because sampling occurs less frequently overall and is particularly important when the sensor itself is a significant portion of the energy drain on the system. The systems can also learn when rapid changes are likely to occur based on statistical analysis of prior measurements or models of phenomenon under investigation, and then iteratively refine and update their routines that they use to operate more efficiently. And I was supposed to be here. You see, but it's hard to see the adaptive sampling run depicted. As you identify areas that have higher concentrations, you then higher spatial and variation, you then spend more time sampling in those areas. So, sort of combining the theme of rapid mobility to achieve density along with a theme of user interactivity to achieve higher information return, we have this topic of rapid deployment that has already been mentioned a couple of times. And rapid deployment systems are systems that are deployed for shorter durations, either repeatedly in the same location when periodic surveys are needed, perhaps monthly or seasonally, or sequentially in different locations up and down a river, for example, to achieve greater spatial extent. And this is a very useful paradigm when the phenomenon changes slowly and can be characterized quickly. The presence of the user in rapid deployments, either continuously or frequently, facilitates timely calibration and maintenance, as is needed for some of the existing chemical sensors that we mentioned. And it also enables some of the triggered physical sample collection that Tom referred to, that you then combine with laboratory analysis. And when you combine triggered sample collection with laboratory analysis, you sort of achieve the functional equivalent of dense biochemical sensing, where the high-density physical sensors record the precise location characteristics in which the physical sample is collected and then analyzed in the lab, some kind of wet chemistry or bioanalysis. Rapid deployment has actually become our most powerful usage model for environmental science, and at the same time it raises some interesting technical challenges. In addition to the system techniques that have to support rapid convergence, if you're only going to be there a short period of time, you have to be able to set up the system quickly to do quick data extraction. These systems also motivate the need for high system visibility, statistical design tools for real-time incremental deployment, and in situ calibration and validation. And this brings us to the question of really the data. And the data returned by these multi-scale, multimodal, actuated systems are complex and pose a host of challenges for the person interpreting them. For the simple act of fusing these sources for use in modeling can involve more than just a simple sort of database merge, if you will. The uncertainty inherent in all the sensors and actuators has to be incorporated into the models and the analyses in order to track how uncertainty propagates through the system. Now, by understanding the correlations between modalities and scales, though, we should be able to design sensing systems that then ease the burden of analysis downstream. It's useful to examine this life cycle of data in a sensing system that starts with design and deployment of the observing system, operation and monitoring, and finally analysis, modeling, and data sharing. Many early visions of network sensing systems sort of ignored deployment design completely, suggesting that sensor nodes would simply be scattered in a region, dropped out of an airplane. And while this is perhaps appropriate when deploying maybe thousands of sensors on a battlefield, magnetometer or something, looking for a relatively large but obvious signal, current sensing practice recognizes that it's rarely possible to deploy enough sensors in this manner to achieve adequate spatial coverage nor good physical coupling of the sensor to the environment when you are looking at environmental phenomenon such as we're discussing here. So sensor placement choices can be informed and need to be informed by other streams of data, and they can benefit from staged or sequential design approaches. Once deployed, data management and analysis remain very important elements of the system. For instance, a decision about where data are to reside, what form they must be, includes making a determination about whether there should be a central repository, and if not, how do you discover and link disparate data sources. Perhaps of greatest import in this phase of the life cycle is actually to maximize data quality and quantity by conducting near real-time checks on the data to identify anomalous data readings that are due to poorly calibrated or placed sensors or other system faults or changes in the environment. And this is another place where handheld sensing systems are a tool that are available during this operational phase of the data life cycle to provide both an interactive window to a user in the field to correlate their visual observations with what the system is reporting, as well as to provide a second source of measurement to use in validation and calibration. Of course, an important data sharing issue is adherence to standard data, metadata formats, which are necessary for data to be shared between different organizations and different disciplines. And these issues are, of course, not unique to distributed embedded sensing systems, but because data sets from these systems are generally large and, as we've described, very heterogeneous, they are particularly complex, and these metadata and data sharing issues come up even within a single deployment and a single study, not just once you share across them. So this brings me to another theme I wanted to emphasize that I've mentioned in passing, which is interactive real-time access to embedded sensing systems, and combining the data from these in situ deployments with other data sources. So really, instead of viewing embedded sensing as a technology that is only useful when fully automated, we see it more like MRI technology in the medical context, which, when combined with image-enhancing signal processing and other measurement modalities, and very importantly with human cognition, provides a tremendously powerful science and engineering tool. And moreover, it's through interactive access to these systems in the field, combined with innovative statistical tools, forming what our co-author Mark Hansen refers to as coupled human observational systems, that we see rays of hope for addressing some of the most difficult issues of calibration and data integrity. In fact, one of the commonalities across all of these themes of mobility, rapid deployment, interaction, is the critical role that statistical techniques need to play in our systems. We see this, and I've mentioned it, in the problems of experimental design and sensor layout. And as we scale up to larger deployments in complex environmental media like soils, there's a need to apply increasingly complex geospatial statistical tools for optimizing sensor placement, subject to things like budget and regulatory constraints as well. And finally, data integrity, I can't say it enough, is clearly one of the most challenging problems in sensing systems generally, and there's much research to be done to develop robust procedures and models for aggregation and analysis. And of course, a key component of, I missed the slide again. Of course, a key component of making sense of all complex data is visualization. And this is a key component of a system that needs to be integrated across the in situ and our other data sources, our GIS, our remote sensing. And it can be relatively audience specific, at least in terms of tailoring the visualization. For some users, the issue, the challenge, is too much information, perhaps the average citizen. For others, it's too little, perhaps the resource manager who's trying to diagnose a problem. And but that being said, and referring to the challenges of visualization, the last decade has seen geographic information systems become increasingly accessible across a very wide range of applications. And today, vast amounts of data are displayed, organized, and searched through map interfaces and sophisticated interfaces such as Google Earth, and are accessible to much larger portions of the public. I don't know how many of you were at the AGU this year, San Francisco, but if you walked around the poster session, every other poster basically said, Google Earth, : and so the incorporation of maps with real-time data feeds is an increasingly important component of visualization, and available component of visualization, and will be critical for these sensing systems. And as I mentioned before, the importance of citizenry sensing, data frameworks for sensing systems may even be developed to support data contributions by the public, as well as communication to the public. So finally, this brings me to the end of my formal remarks. And I hope that added to illustrating how wireless sensing has a lot to offer when it comes to water quality and management, that heterogeneous and interactive sensing systems are a promising arena for future development, and that participatory sensing that exploits the widely proliferated platforms and infrastructure will bring sensing and not just communication to everyday life. And with that, I'll hand it over to Jeff. And I'll get out of your way.
Thanks. I'm going to switch seats.
Yeah.
Well, so we've shown you a handful of examples that we think begin to define a vision of how distributed network sensing systems can be used to address water quality management issues. We've described many of the important considerations when thinking about how to use distributed sensing systems, the state of the sensor technology, the different types of systems, when it's appropriate to use each, and the issues surrounding the flow of data. And now what I'd like to do is put forward a few key recommendations for steps that we think ought to be taken in order to move us forward towards that vision which Tom laid out for us. These recommendations are taken from the white paper that you can pick up here, and while they're probably incomplete, they do hit on several important points. So we've heard a lot already about the state of sensors from Tom and Deborah. We've looked at them in terms of their field readiness and their scalability. Field readiness relates to their survivability in harsh environments for long periods, and scalability, on the other hand, is related to our ability to deploy large numbers of these in an area, when that's, of course, related to their cost. So if you can only afford one or two sensors for a monitoring effort, your ability to understand what's going on may be constrained. But if the sensors are inexpensive, you can achieve greater spatial coverage and deploy them in this multi-scale fashion that we've described. So with this in mind, we break down our sensor recommendations based on what we think is more of a long-term effort and what types of impacts can be achieved on the short term. So as we saw earlier, few biological sensors are ready to be deployed in the field as part of these systems. And this is not because we don't know how to detect organisms and their characteristics, but rather because the methods that we have require bulky machines and they're confined to laboratories. So research related to miniaturizing these machines and discovering new mechanisms for detection that can be made compact this is ongoing work, and we need to continue to support that. But we should be aware that the payoffs on that type of research is relatively long-term, 5, 10, or more years. It's essential to do, but we need to recognize the payoff is down the road. On the other hand, there are cases in which the detection methods have been developed, and the sensors are nearly ready to be packaged for deployment in the field. And so in cases such as these, the problem is not so much in discovering new means of detection, but in making the sensors robust enough to withstand harsh environments for long periods. So here we're likely to see payoffs in periods of months to years as companies do the more focused development needed to bring established methods and devices to market as affordable and robust products. So let's look at a case in point here. At our center, as I think we heard already, we've been working on a prototype nitrate sensor that's smaller and likely to be less expensive than its commercially available counterpart. The two sensors perform basically equally in terms of things like their sensitivity and their precision. In a laboratory setting, they have similar lifespans. But in the field, the prototype is very quickly fouled and loses its accuracy. So here's an illustration of our prototype sensor. The sensing element is the diameter of a human hair. The sensor package itself is also very small. It allows it to be precisely placed in the soil, for instance. And while perhaps that's less relevant to water quality, the small size of these sensors allow researchers to position them very precisely. For instance, at the near individual plant root tips, as you can see here, in order to get very highly localized information about nitrogen uptake. And so you can imagine how much more information about nitrate, the key nutrient, could be collected if this less expensive prototype sensor could last longer in the field. So in this case, what's needed, again, is not some major innovation in the detection technology. Rather, just a motivated company could probably invest in the development of more robust materials in order to make this product more robust and relatively quickly turn out a viable commercial product. So next, I want to talk a little bit about systems and data. Now, Deborah touched on some of this. I just want to emphasize a few more key points. So we don't need to do a lot of basic research on these systems in order to begin addressing water quality issues using the technology. What we do need to do is take existing technology into the field and pilot the types of studies and deployments that Tom described. What are the specific system requirements for looking at septic systems, for instance? And how would we implement such a system? Questions like these are very specific and have to be addressed by really getting your hands dirty, getting out there in the field. What we've found at our center to be essential in piloting deployments is a very tight coupling between and relationships between what we call the applied side and the technology side. So the applied side here are the field technicians and resource managers who want the answers, and the technology side, the engineers and programmers. And this association keeps the application requirements in line with what's technically feasible and ensures that the technology does what the application folks really want and not something that's very, very cool technologically but not necessary for the application. So some of the systems that we've described, these static sensing systems, and even, for instance, that cabled robot, you saw the picture moving across the river, these are currently available commercially. Other systems are not. But by doing pilot studies, defining the requirements for precision, resolution, spatial extent, and so forth, we'll be determining specifically what's needed in various applications and encouraging the emergence of commercial markets for these systems. Now, We do still need to do basic research, I think, as Deborah already mentioned, in certain areas to make systems more viable for wide-scale use. First, as we heard, data integrity is critical. Sensing technology is only as valuable as the data are believable. And so this is a challenge we discuss at length in the white paper. There are lots of ways data can be corrupt and systems can fault, but there are fortunately lots of ways we can prevent that and deal with it as well. We simply need to continue to investigate this issue through basic and applied research. The flip side of the challenge of data integrity, though, are the opportunities presented by modeling. Oftentimes, we want to know how natural engineered systems function overall, how they respond to perturbations, as opposed to merely determining the value of a parameter at a specific point. And so the data provided by distributed network sensing systems can collectively provide powerful information via models, even if there's some uncertainty in specific measurements. The real power of these systems can come out when integrated with even simple models. And I want to do another case study here that goes into a little more detail on a story that Tom started as he began his talk. So the benefits of using reclaimed wastewater for irrigation in agriculture are fairly obvious. The concern, though, that wastewater laden with nutrients could contaminate the groundwater or soil and run off into streams. But real-time distributed sensing can be used to actually control irrigation such that the nitrate levels are maintained in a suitable range. So our setup in Palmdale, California, in a field with a center pivot irrigation system, we've deployed a series of sensors above and below ground. Above, the climate station, as Tom mentioned, tells us about temperature, humidity, wind speed. Below ground, we look at soil moisture, soil nitrate, and soil temperature. So there are basic one-dimensional hydrologic models that balance the water entering and leaving via irrigation, evaporation, and uptake, and you can figure out the distribution of nitrate in the soil. Data collected by the system can then be used to determine coefficients of the model for a particular situation and location. We call this training the model, and trained models can then be used to predict how nitrate levels will vary under different conditions of irrigation and climate. By running the model in a forecasting mode with the real-time data feeding back into the model, we can set the system to control irrigation, the frequency and duration, for instance, to prevent undesirable outcomes like nitrogen concentrations rising above some threshold that's established. So this is a neat example of how these sensing systems in combination with models can be used as a powerful way a tool for resource management. The third section of our recommendations talks about education and training. Distributed sensing it's an innovative technology, and education and training are critical for any new technology adoption. And this applies for distributed sensing at multiple levels. So current technology, even if it's just a tape measure and a notebook, is used to really great effect in a variety of environmental monitoring efforts right now. And we need to recognize that there's an appropriate tendency for people to not want to fix what's not perceived to be broken. So the technology adoption will not necessarily be uniformly welcomed by people who will be affected by it. And we need to be clear with them and ourselves of what the benefits are in terms of gaining access to new data that you can't collect with old technology, enhancing data quality, and gaining efficiencies in time and cost. Furthermore, environmental data can be is often used in fairly high-stakes decision-making, so it's critical to educate decision makers, get their buy-in so that they understand how these systems work and that they believe the answers that are provided are trustworthy. And then finally, education training of future water resource professionals is critical to make sure there's a steady supply of people ready to use these technologies now and in the future. And of course, this is true in many areas, but with environmental sensing using distributed networked technology, this requires expertise in a variety of disciplines: engineering, computer science, and environmental science. And these are not traditionally taught together, so we need to really encourage this type of multidisciplinary educational opportunities. So Tom told you this vision of what's possible. Deborah talked about the state of the art. I've tried to provide some recommendations for steps to move forward. There are questions remaining. Where do you think this type of technology will be most useful? What incentives can we put into place to encourage its use, and how do we create markets to encourage commercialization of the technology? What types of partnerships are needed to move forward, and what have we missed in this short presentation that deserves more attention? So before we move on to discuss those questions and others you have, I just want to take a minute to thank you for coming out this morning and listening to this and speaking with us. I also want to thank the Wilson Center, especially Dave Rajeski, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and Deanna Likas and Bob Olson. Thanks also to the Environmental Protection Agency for supporting this project. So I'll throw it back to our moderator, and we can enter into discussion.
Dave is actually at a place that he retreats to now and then in Massachusetts, where the houses all need sensors for their septic field. He would like to create a demonstration project right there. We have till 11 o'clock, so we have plenty of time for questions and answers. Michael.
Hi, thank you. Michael Brody with EPA. EPA has a lot of new voluntary programs with combined animal feeding operations, a big non-point source nutrient issue. I was wondering if you could describe what a pilot test might look like for a problem like that. And I'm also particularly interested in how you approach the issue of the detection level, and not just the detection, what ways you go about doing that. So.
Okay, this is very relevant in my backyard. We have massive dairies right now with just that problem, and the cow is out of the barn, so to speak, on that because the nitrate is shut down a lot of wells already. What I'm proposing, and in fact will be piloting with a consortium of dairies, is to take the Palmdale approach instead of the groundwater monitoring approach, where you find out it's a problem when it's a problem, to instrument the vadose zone beneath the dairies and around the ponds and in the fields where the manure may be being applied. Look at the different management practices and how they impact the transport through the soil in an effort to try to identify poor practices early in the game and correct them that way before it's a groundwater problem. We will see the nitrate. We will be deploying some nitrate ISEs, which, as Jeff accurately pointed out, are kind of screening level tools. They're not precise, but we think we know them well enough now. We've tried them on several 1 to 2 week long test applications where we think we can see the difference between, say, 5 and 15 ppm, changes of that sort. We cannot see the difference between 5 and 6 ppm with these. So these sorts of things we'll be doing with so the nitrate, and then of course more importantly we'll have the water through moisture content, which is if you can follow the water, you can usually follow the nitrate pretty well. So that's probably our first line of defense: the moisture sensors and temperature sensors with climate sensors above ground, and then shoring it up with modeling. Then not to make this too long an answer, sorry, but. Then, of course, you're in a one-dimensional world at that point, and you have to turn your head to the question of traditional soil sampling, teasing out the geospatial soil characteristics and determining with your budget where to put the sensors in order to guarantee to some level of certainty that the nitrate's not passing a certain level. Let's see, the second part of your question was about the level of. You mean like
the
sensitivities? Yeah. So it's a chore that my group hates right now, but say last week we were at the San Joaquin River. We were looking at sensors in the hypereic zone, trying to pick up fluxes of nutrients in or out of the river. And we had 20 sensors with us. Each one of those had to receive an 11 standard calibration before it went into the ground to pick up the relationship between millivolts, which is what the sensor pumps out, and the concentration. Then at the end of the day, when the end of the 2-week period, we pull them out of the ground and we're not done. We have to take them out of the apparatus and recalibrate them again. Then probably the question that's popping into your mind right now is, well, those calibrations are different at time 0 and time 2 weeks. So when did it change? What was the pattern of the change? And so the actual one of the purposes of this test was we are trying to create an in situ calibration technique, because it's so much effort to get these things well placed in the ground. You don't want to pull them out and calibrate them every day. So we've been attaching what we call umbilical cords to each sensor, and this way the technician can dose it and sort of get a chromatographic response each day, and integrate that response and see. We're working on it. We don't have it yet. If we can come up with sort of an analog chromatographic algorithm that would link that to how well it's maintaining its calibration. So that's, as Deborah alluded to, probably unacceptable at a large scale. We're going to need things that are more manageable than that in the long run if this is going to have traction.
But some of those techniques lend you to better models, and so some of the issues of calibration may be consistent across. They're not subject to the particular fouling that happened there. They're somewhat a function of the sensor themselves. So you do this over instrumentation and validation to develop a better model of the particular device, and then you have the appropriate sort of calibration curves to then do your
And I should clarify, these were commercial sensors. These were the $500 sensors. These were not the $10 ones that die in a few hours.
But expensive seismometers actually have internal calibration mechanisms of a similar kind, and the more expensive the instrument, we will look for things like that you can actually do that are built in. In other cases, with much better modeling, you then might well have procedures that you do the kind of as with the tablet flush down the toilet, where you do periodic known stimulus testing of the system. Is going to be essential, and then the tools for doing this kind of pre-post facto calibration and cleaning and processing your data are just an essential part of it. So I think increasingly, in addition to the investment in the sensors and the investment in trying out these prototype deployments, are these sorts of tools that are actually going to make the data really useful.
In the back.
National Weather Service is deploying instrument platforms in commercial aviation now as a way of increasing the spatial and temporal resolution of weather data, which also reduces the need for miniaturization. Wonder if you think, or when you think, sensor platforms would be applicable for commercial shipping, both surface water and land. Another area I was wondering if we could talk about is the progress we're making in gene chips and protein chips that might be usable for detecting chemicals and biologicals, and kind of some of the policy implications of deployment, such as if we do get miniaturization to the point where perhaps we could distribute sensors with recreational fishing permits.
Interesting stuff. If I answer the one about the commercial boats, will someone else take the gene chips? Another really timely question. I was talking to a fellow last week who looked at the air quality impacts of commercial shipping, and he showed me some maps that he was generating of the shipping routes. I had no idea. When he clicked the button on the map of the Pacific and showed the shipping routes, the blue water went away, and it just red lines everywhere. And so I immediately thought the same thing, this would be such an incremental cost to have these guys drag commercial sensors across. And I am aware of one very relatively long-term effort in the ferry system off of North Carolina. I think it's called Ferrymon, M-O-N, that the ferries have been taking some basic water quality probes back and forth on the routes to the islands. So you might want to take a look at that if you haven't seen that. Let's see.
That's an easier one to refer to. I mean, of course, what's nice in water context as well is you can drag these things. There's always the issue of interference with what you're churning up the water and you're expelling things into the water, and so some interesting questions there just in terms of the quality of your measurements. But it's this whole issue of exploiting mobility to get that kind of coverage is tremendously important. And as you pointed out, the incremental cost and power, you don't have to worry as much about miniaturization and things, is tremendous. Issues such as dwell time to get good readings and things like that are, of course, become an issue when you're doing these things opportunistically. But I think it's one of these things that can be pursued much more quickly, in great contrast to your second question, where these gene and protein chips. I think it's a tremendous area for investment. There are folks from the National Science Foundation, and that work should continue to be invested in. It also is fortunately something that the biotech industry invests in heavily for their process development and lab base. And any time that we can, on our side of some divide, benefit from billions of dollars of investment by them to later exploit, as in many of these cases where both medical and automotive and industrial processes moved these sensors to the point that they're commercial and readily available. I think the same will apply there. So it's not that we should not invest in that for these applications, but just it's going to take a fair amount of time of maturation. Some of the things that I think it can particularly benefit from the focus and will need to be focused on from our side of the sort of funding and R&D investment is to work on things like sample preparations. Our colleague and co-author Y.C. Tai from Caltech. It's one thing to sort of have increasing the detection capability that you have on these lab-on-a-chip systems, and if they're part of some lab-based system, then you can have a lot of apparatus that's actually doing the sample preparation, at which point you then use these chips for rapid and low-cost and very high-precision detection. But if you want these things to be autonomously placed, they also have to do the sample prep process and grab the sample and to make use of these detection capabilities. So that's something where, particularly for these water aquatic-based applications, fresh, saltwater, what have you, is going to be, I think, a really good place to focus some R&D. I am not good at guessing sort of time frame of that availability. I'd say it's probably easy to say it's not next year. And then you asked a question about, but maybe it was a joke, about policy and something about commercial fishing, but Jeff gets that one.
Well, just back to the chip technology. We didn't bring a picture of it, but I've seen from our colleagues these tiny little chips sitting on a lab bench with, 50 or 100 little tubes sticking off, and the whole thing is you have to carry in your arms, even though the sensing chip is this size. So that's just a more visual illustration of what Deborah was talking about. They're not really there to be deployed autonomously yet. The question about commercial shipping?
Fishing.
No,
Recreational fishing.
Well, I think that gets into an area that we're starting to develop, this notion of citizen sensing using handheld computers and that sort of thing. So that's in its early stages still, but I think that looking down the road, that we could certainly put energy there to incorporate sensors with permits that integrate through Bluetooth or other interfaces with people's cellular phones or PDAs and send the data back to wherever it'll be most useful.
And so much of what's powerful about it is that it's automatically geocoded, georeferenced, time-coded, and uploaded. So there's and that ability to just, with something like this, if it had a camera in it, to bring in the contextual and standard protocols for people who are out in the field recreationally or otherwise to collect image data in addition to what might be a Bluetooth little kit that you might collect, is really something that I'd say could be in the next year. A whole range of things like that could very readily be done.
I think we mentioned in the white paper there's an EPA program, World Water Day, where they send little water quality kits out to people via mail. And so if those folks have cell phones, you could start sending them little sensors, I suppose.
There's a question right here in front. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. You've got the microphone.
Demi Siriopoulou, I'm Assistant Director of R&D Civil Works for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. My question is, who has sponsored so far your research, and what partnerships have you developed for future research and for applications?
Oh my God, thank you. Thank you. We are a National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center, and we're quite grateful for that. We didn't mention our funders, and they're sitting in the audience. So we are very fortunate to have received 5 years ago one of these STC awards to fund this very multidisciplinary and multi-institutional effort, a very experimental effort, and application-oriented applications merging with the technology to really sort of drive us, as Jeff focused. So we get the bulk of our funding from the National Science Foundation through that core Science and Technology Center program, with additional funding through applications to other programs. And even through that additional funding, the bulk of our funding all comes at this point from the National Science Foundation. And I'm sure that's something that they would love to see us diversify in. They're very proud of us, but I'm sure that they'd be even happier if we tripled our funding base by being able to bring this technology out to increasingly to deployment and stewardship agencies, such as yours.
Okay. Here in front.
Yes, I'm Chuck Lawson from the State Department. I have a historical comment and then a question that the two are completely unrelated. The historical comment comes back to the point about dragging sensors behind ships. Lots of the early bathymetric data collected in the Pacific Ocean was collected during World War II, and that was because Harry Hess, a very well-known geologist who was in the Navy during the war, dictated that ships would drag sensors behind as they went out to the Pacific and back. My question has to do, you talked about sensors that are ready for deployment now and commercially available, et cetera, but you really didn't mention, and I'm wondering, are commercial sensors now deployed in the way that you're talking about? Are there real-world examples where people are just using networks like this on a daily basis, or is it still all kind of research, applied research level where you're still testing things and nobody's really using it widely, on a daily basis and just using it in their day-to-day work?
There are some pretty good examples out there of sort of tip of the iceberg type applications. The one that I use almost every day is called the California Digital Exchange Center, and this is a network of about 20 sort of traditional gauging stations along the San Joaquin River Basin, but they've been telemetered, and they deliver in a nice network interface the flows and in some cases salinities, so that you get a gross picture of the basin and where the flows are, what the reservoir releases are. We use this, this is our homework every night before we go to the field. What's the flow conditions out there? And this is sort of, but it's very coarse. And then we zoom in and do things in a high resolution.
It's an excellent question, and I think we're largely on the cusp. You do see different sets of instruments and deployed and distributed sensing in industrial settings. Increasingly, things like condition-based maintenance is one of the first. It's something we, in fact, don't really focus on because it's much more of sort of a commercialized market. And you do have the National Science Foundation now proceeding with these continental scale observatories. So NEON, National Ecological Observatory Network, and WATERS, which it represents that these things do require investment. They do require a pretty well-stated need and purpose for the data that then guides their placement and all the associated models and tools with them. And so I think it's not as something you sort of casually go out to decide to observe and then decide what to do. And so we're starting to see those more directed efforts happening on a smaller sort of prototyping and piloting scale and on some of these larger scales. And then Jeff has...
Yeah, and so in a couple of other examples, we put something in here that golf courses manage water and so forth. So those systems are commercially available and used routinely. And if you keep track of sensor network technology, wineries are using these things for microclimate and water and so forth.
The size of a golf course hole goes right in.
Those are moisture sensors.
Moisture.
Yeah.
Dennis.
Hi, Dennis O'Connor from EPA. I have two questions. A simple, straightforward one, I hope, and might require a little more. First off, have you thought about applying this to other media? Almost all of our tough environmental decisions, quite frankly, are cross-media or multimedia. And you've got an interesting platform here. What about the air? I ask that because I come from the Air Office, and monitoring is a big deal there and an expensive one. And the second question, or just observation, you have in the title here, management is part of it, what you're looking at. But I thought a little thin on, in fact, how are decision makers going to use this latest, greatest, best information? It seems to me often that's where things fall apart. We collect wonderful information. It never gets into the decision metric. If you devoted some time and effort to that as well.
Go ahead.
I forgot the first part.
Okay, well, the first part about air,
Air, yeah.
It's something of, I think, great interest and opportunity. It also, on the other hand, when it comes to groundwater and soil and water, you can't do anything with remote sensing beyond the very, very surface layer, so there are no other ways of doing it. And in the context of air quality, I think, of course, small spatial variation questions, you need more dense sensing. It's a much more rapid process. Fusion is even more rapid, and there are some abilities to do this with larger scale devices. So I think that's why we've gone. I often say that I don't. You go to where you have a much. You can't do it any other way, and then the demand is a little more elastic in terms of how much it costs or how well you do. Right? No other way to do it. You're likely to have a wider range of success. And so starting in water, I think in some of these technologies has been one of the reasons why that's happened faster. That's not to say it's not applicable to air, but it's a little bit of a different definition of that market. I'll pass it over to Tom for the management part. I do just want to say, though, that I think that the way to pursue this quite effectively is, in fact, to be thinking about the management component first in terms of deciding what data and information and what precision, what is actually relevant to that management question, and then to design and tailor that system top down. So it's a little bit, if you just do that and you don't look at the underlying capabilities, you start talking about things like biodiversity tricorders and things that aren't really doable at this point in time. So you want to know sort of the underlying capabilities, but then you really want to go up to the management question, and that's where I think we're right now at a place where we should start doing some of those pilot tests, taking a critical management question and designing some pilot tests that we go out and do and try to really close that circuit in an important way.
Just to cap off the discussion on air, and I'm not generally an air researcher, so I don't know the state of the sensors as well in air, but it does seem like an outstanding opportunity for the citizen sentry with sensors on the phone. Just think of getting 20 million data points a day about air quality at nose level in a basin is pretty powerful data that could come in. On the thank you for the comment on management, because I think the white paper might be a little thin in that area, and what we're really trying to achieve here, and what brought me into this research effort was knowledge through programs like Superfund and similar sorts of settings where the decision-making process gets bogged down by uncertainty. The data are vague enough that there's wiggle room on either side of the issue, and it falls on the decision maker's lap to make the hard decision. And I think from a technology and environmental science side of this, we're trying to really compress that time frame between when the data is collected and it's fully analyzed. In the past, it's been collect it, digest it, start to analyze it, model it. The decision was made back here. We need to accelerate that whole sequence, parallelize it, and then enable the decision makers even to interact with the data themselves to get a better feel for it and hopefully come to the right decision more quickly.
Michael?
Well, you did mention at least two sort of automated management examples, the irrigation and then maybe the CSO rerouting water automatically. We've heard someone talk about placing sensors in water infrastructure itself to turn treatment processes on and off. But what about in this CAFO study? Do you think that some of the management practices could actually, if you got a sensor, lighting up, if you'll pardon the analogy, that it would actually, there's enough potential for automating the management practice, so rather than going to a person, it would change something right there. Could that be built into your pilots?
Is there anyone from the dairy industry here? Because my half cynical, half honest response is that maybe that sensor should light up and say, you have 5,000 too many cows on this land. And so I don't know what, I'm on that, I am fairly certain about what the results are going to show in this sensor network. So I'm happy I'm working with some progressive dairymen who actually want to know that because they see regulations changing and they want to know sustainable levels. That'll be a difficult management decision because there's big economics involved in other states that maybe would be happy to see those dairymen move their stock to that state.
But different problems have different time scales, right? The rate at which those numbers fluctuate, or someone was just talking yesterday about that. A lot of the methane problem can be addressed with different feed. It's more expensive, but that causes the animals to produce less methane. So it's some of those are management problems where you need the information to better inform the decision. There are other problems though that you're talking about that are much faster time scale and starting to look at this in the way that people are looking at and to some extent the way the power grid operates and doing more of that with the kind of real-time closed loop control that we're talking about for the Palmdale agricultural system. I think there are opportunities for that kind of real-time control that let you operate closer to the edge, if you will, but safely, that are of great interest. And both of those, the longer timescale management, which is how I had interpreted the question originally, as well as the closed loop real-time management, are definitely often in different contexts, but quite doable once we have ability to calibrate sensors and things like that. And they're not disconnected because some of that closed loop control feeds that once a day or once a week stimulus to your system that lets you then do the measurement that lets you adjust your output. So that actuation part of the system is quite important and quite doable if you have the transducers to get you the right data.
Let me put out a question too. I know from talking to you that you've been motivated by longer-term visions of where all this can go, and I wonder if you'd share your thoughts there. I'm really looking out to decades, what becomes possible, and then the second part is to pull into the near term. We obviously have a lot of people here from EPA, so if you have any thoughts about how EPA could contribute to this moving forward, doing things that they're not doing yet, feel free to put it out.
I'll answer your second question. If you answered that question the last time, it must have been you didn't see me sigh on the other end of the phone. I find doing projections out. I come from the technology side of the world, internet development, and projecting out. We were the ones. I was part of the community that originally the internet was supposed to be for file sharing, and it was the internet folks who missed even developing the web. So it's it's great technology, but things always come to surprise you. That being said, I think the things we can do, there is a future out there that will let us achieve, could let us achieve sustainability in many different dimensions, because, as Tom was saying, we would have much more precise and real-time measures of our impact, and would feed back to management, both automated and manual. And that's a vision that we clearly need across a whole range of activities, from individual activities. I mean, we've played with the idea of the individual environmental impact report that you don't get on a monthly or yearly, or when you decide to buy a particular type of automobile or decide whether to install a sewage system or septic, but rather something that informs you based on your behavior each day, both what's been your exposure to environmental contaminants because of your proximity to roads and other things, as well as what impact you've had on the world because you chose to drive at a particular time of day, or took particular side roads, or took public transportation. We have the ability, with the extent to which we're all instrumented now with GPS-enabled cell phones and all of that, to really bring the measurement and the report down to a spatial precision and a temporal precision that I think can impact decisions that people make on an everyday basis. And so I think that's out there in the future, and quite important. I think that the way we get there and the role that folks like the EPA have to take is on things that can't be just done at an individual level, but need to be done through figuring out how to use this technology in effective ways to inform management. And the way we're going to get there, between having the capability of the devices that we can show you, that system became effective for the golf course because it was in the a financially viable thing to do for the golf course to put in that system to manage their resources. And now there is you have a web-based nice interface to the system, and the whole complete system is there. And for a lot of these things, that's why the EPA exists. There isn't that market to close that loop and create that full end-to-end integrated system to come into play. And we have to do that together by going out and going after targeted deployments. And initially they can be small. These technologies do scale down. You don't have to do them globally to have them effective. And so we need to go out and do full end-to-end deployments that are driven by management decisions that need to be made, and pull the end-to-end systems together. And then they can be much more easily replicated.
I think if I look out 10 to 15 years, I would really like to see an integrated continental scale national water quality network. I would like to see that box on the back page of the paper that covers the weather, and sadly in my part of the country also has the EPA's good data on air quality. And every kid in first grade up in California knows whether it was an orange day or a red day because they couldn't go out on the playground. I'd like to see that little part of the paper grow over the years so that we are forecasting the different conditions, making people aware of what their environment is like. People in California support air quality research initiatives because every day they see orange and red. And I think if they start to see water quality issues every day. I see a change. I see changes in the Central Valley in California also because we have urbanization happening. Lots and lots of houses are springing up. So all of a sudden, it's not just one owner looking at that river anymore. It's a whole tract of homes, and people are starting to ask questions like, "Why does that river look so bad?" And so I would like to see these kinds of changes nationalized through the Waters Network Initiative, through the NEON Initiative, so that all this information is more accessible to not only the technical and decision-making people, but the citizens.
Well, I want to thank you so much for producing this beautiful report and for coming here to share it with us.